Ahsoka, Balance of Truth, Book 1, Chapter 25. Kawani had no problem finding the hilt. Getting to it, however, was going to be an issue, and she knew it was solely her responsibility to retrieve it. Ahsoka would not assist. It lay 20 meters away in the bog, half submerged, emitter side downward. She slapped herself in the face, keeping her palm firmly in place while thinking about how to carry out the task. She heard Ahsoka stop beside her. "Oh boy," Ahsoka said. Kawani felt terrible at the onset, but was buoyed by the sort of success of her initial attempt. She closed her eyes again and found the flow immediately, this time not putting as much force behind the push. She could feel resistance this time, and fatigue she did not experience the first time. She would have to intensify the initial surge and taper the flow off quickly, otherwise she was doomed to the same outcome. Having been around Ahsoka long enough to know that Togruta had an incredible level of patience, but also felt the need not to test that now. She didn't think about it, she just did it. Opening one eye, she saw the hilt jump from its position, change angle slightly, then drop right back down into the muck a meter from its original orientation, emitter end down again. "That's gonna leave a mark," Ahsoka whispered. "Okay, good start. It will have more energy after it leaves the water. Slightly more," Kawani finished the thought and went right to carry it out. Ahsoka crossed her arms in front of her chest, impressed at the focus, ability, and perseverance to accomplish the task. She nodded in approval. She watched as the hilt jumped its way across the remaining distance, sometimes levitating for a few seconds before falling back into the brackish watery mud, other times firing off a few feet backward. 4 more times, the emitter had landed headlong into the mud, each generating a muffled groan. Although that could lend itself to the next lesson, she thought with a smile. Kawani was down to her knees, breathing heavily and feeling every muscle ache when the blade hilt was finally within reach. "Almost got it," she breathed one more deep breath, then felt the hilt finally hit her palm. Closing her fingers a second too late, she shot her other hand over to assist and began fumbling it between both. The thought of physically firing it back into the mud through sheer clumsiness struck her, and she let it drop between her feet. She fell on it to secure its position. She then rolled onto her back with the saber hilt held high above her body in the most undeserved victory she had ever encountered. Completely exhausted and panting rapidly, she looked at Ahsoka as her arm was finally too heavy to hold up. "So, how did I do?" she laboriously asked. "I don't think it will ever work again," Ahsoka said, shaking her head. "Come on, Annie, we need to keep going." The thought of getting up seemed a monumental task, but Kawani assumed this was also part of the training. The exhaustion truly surprised her, although through her memory, she had the same issues with channeling many years ago and understood the relationship and how things became easier with time, but also with knowledge, and through that, confidence. She rolled over and staggered to her feet. Ahsoka hadn't moved at all, arms still crossed before her. "Oh, oh yeah, I'm leader. I forgot about that." She willed the words from her lips. She found herself completely discombobulated, not entirely remembering from which way they had come, nor where they were headed. She knew she needed to settle that, and again, Ahsoka would not assist. She closed her eyes and focused on herself for a moment. Through that, she could at the very least get her bearings and ground herself as a pivoting point. She had not expected the difficulty in performing the task, which was second nature. "Using the Force is exhausting," she said out loud, but more for her benefit. "At first, yes, then you train yourself to prepare for it over time. Eventually, you become it. So long as you don't lose yourself to it, it's effortless," Ahsoka stated. "The danger is not knowing where that line is," she said. Her words felt heavy and full of sorrow. "Like Tsar?" Kawani asked quickly. "Like Tsar, yes, and many, many others, Ani." She hesitated with the mention of the Zeltran, but sincerely felt the truth of the statement overall. She had brought herself to that point and pushed ever so slightly further every time she had put herself into one of her profound meditations. The sense of complete serenity was an addiction to most, and she had felt its pull many times. I see the truth of it, Kawani said as she slowly led on toward the unknown vessel, finally getting her bearings and her breath. Ahsoka fell in line behind her, aware but also internalizing the ordeal over the Zeldrin. She understood his desire to both remain in that blissful state and to return to the mortal realm at will. How both could be so beneficial, yet so detrimental. Guilt crept its way into her thoughts. Was it her right to take that from him? Who was she to assume the role of arbiter, and on whose behalf? The Force? The Force can and always would take care of itself, allowing no one to abuse it beyond reproach. She knew that, regardless of element, nature, or aspect, the Force would out-persevere anything else. Therein lies the truth of it all. The Force is and will always be. The ship, pod, is just up ahead, Kawani said and picked up her pace somewhat. Well done, Ani. Ahsoka was impressed as they rounded a final tree and came into full view of a well-aged escape pod. Through the entire ordeal with the saber, she overcame and got them precisely where they wanted to go. She knew how taxing it was to draw upon the Force initially, reminding herself every day never to forget where she came from. That Kawani was able to bring them to the destination was very impressive indeed. It's been here for ages, I'd say, Kawani remarked. At least 20 years, I would say. That's fairly precise, Kawani turned to Ahsoka. You knew this was here the entire time. That's not all, Ahsoka said, laughing. Look, she added, pointing to their right. Kawani spun to look at the backside of the Mirai, fading into and out of view with the passing mists 40 meters away. Out of nowhere, Kawani spun back around and punched Ahsoka in the shoulder. Ahsoka couldn't help but laugh. It's the only flat and dry, I might add, ground for kilometers, she managed, the laughter having a hard time leaving her. For the record, the pod looks Corellian. CR-90 Corvette, I'd wager, Kawani said, bringing Ahsoka out of her reverie. You know your ships, Ani, precisely, Ahsoka returned. Senator Organa. She started, but immediately lost the words to emotion. She put her hands on her hips and looked skyward briefly, closing her eyes as she rocked on her feet. She could feel the dregs of sorrow churning deep within her, the sorrow from loss and tormenting grief. Kawani noticed it immediately and rushed to Ahsoka's side to place a hand on her shoulder. Damning her exhaustion and forgetting that she didn't have the energy, she channeled her own emotion into her friend. Feeling the despair and utter desolation Ahsoka carried, something deeper than recent events was clinging to the Togruta. Something, what, she couldn't say, couldn't possibly know, only that it was stuck to her. It was an old pain. Decades? A lifetime of pain? Was it that Ahsoka had never known anything but grief her whole life? Possibly. She would settle this in time. She just skimmed the surface, retrieving what Ahsoka would be willing to part with, and funneled it away from her. Come on, Ahsoka, let's get off this planet. Kawani wrapped an arm around Ahsoka and escorted her to the Mirai. Punching in the borrowed access code, she patiently waited for the ramp to finish its activation and cycled down with a refreshing hiss. Ani, Ahsoka said. Yep, right here, Kawani returned. I can't wait to eat some rations. I'm starving. Thank you for saying it first. One more bowl of whatever that was, and I would have gotten sick, Kawani laughed out the words. They both walked up the rear ramp, arms around each other's shoulder, enjoying yet another laugh. Probably not the last one at the expense of Master Yoda's culinary abilities. Ahsoka breathed heavily as the rear ramp hissed its final blast, accentuating her sense of finality. Although relieved of some of the burden she had been carrying through the much-needed counsel of Yoda, and by lucky chance, that of Qui-Gon, she was becoming increasingly retrospective since leaving her old friend. She had always considered herself balanced, somewhere between introverted and extroverted. The events over the last 24 hours seemed to have opened a new corridor within her of things that needed attention, if not at least contemplation. She had always handled these confluences of potentiality by closing herself off from the rest of the galaxy and entering her substantially deep meditative state. However, through her own choice, she was not alone now. That thought, which had never crossed her path since Mandalore, was a new feeling altogether, one of nostalgia and comfort, a certain serenity and hope. Whatever path was to be taken would be taken with the Mirialan. Ani, did you did very well earlier. That perseverance will see you through any training yet to come, she said, looking at her friend. Kawani turned around, not expecting the comment. She hadn't expected any praise for her feeble attempts at what should be second nature for a youngling. Thank you, I think. I didn't realize it would be so difficult, honestly. Have to walk before you can run, Ahsoka said with a wink. Her face turned a little more serious. Moving objects will just take practice. Remember that your will is your strongest focus and energy source. Kawani nodded discreetly and lifted her hand slightly, holding the hilt of the saber tightly. I don't know if it will ever work again, she said, staring at the mud-crusted and heavily dented casing. I'm glad you mentioned that. A small smile returned to Ahsoka's face. Cleaning it is your next task. Kawani continued staring at the hilt. I've been wondering about that myself. Not that I wouldn't have cleaned it, but it will need to be removed to do that. I have been looking it over from top to bottom and don't understand how it is assembled. No tabs, no seams, no welds, no screws. It is a solid piece, at least the outside anyway. How do I get inside it? A lightsaber is made in concert with the Force. So it is unmade, Ahsoka said, taken back to her childhood with the thought. It is a unique bonding between the crafter and the Force itself. So I will need you then to take it apart, Kawani concluded. No. A severe expression washed over Ahsoka's features. The lesson is understanding that your will meets your determination. Focus on the objective, see it with clarity, and you will understand how to accomplish the task. Kawani said nothing, just continued to stare at the hilt. You ponder that. I have to try getting some messages through, Ahsoka said, brushing lightly past Kawani on the ramp up to the holosuite. Kawani raised her other hand to cradle the hilt in both palms, sat cross-legged on the cargo bay platform, and looked intently at its surfaces. Rolling it over, she saw a solid casing with a mud-choked ring at one end, the emitter port, she assumed. Although, if it was the emitter, it seemed to be on the wrong end of the thing. She wrapped her right hand around it and squeezed, turning it end over end a few times, and concluded that she was holding it the right way, or at least the way she would keep it. Located the activation switch, and sure enough, the emitter was on the back end of the weapon. She cataloged the information, and then looked at it again, splayed in both palms. How the hell does this thing come apart? Ahsoka knew Kawani would figure it out, eventually. It took a tremendous amount of focus to disassemble an actual lightsaber. Anyone could, of course, smash them open. They weren't made of cortosis after all. But Kawani wasn't anyone, and destruction wasn't the goal. She padded up the decking and fell into the chair at the holotable controls, keying in the connection data. The room flickered a familiar blue momentarily before the Twi'lek form of a dear friend materialized at a 1/3 scale before her. Ahsoka, it is great to see you. A very heartfelt greeting came from Hera Syndulla. Likewise, Hera. Apologies for not getting back to you sooner, and I am very sorry about the loss of Kanan, Ahsoka said shamefully. He passed so that we may live. Hera turned her smile into stoic resolution, the face Ahsoka knew more than any other from the Twi'lek. He always questioned his place until the time came. His moment came, she said, her voice wavering. She paused briefly to compose herself, or so Ahsoka assumed. But because of his sacrifice, that particular mission was completed, and because of that, we succeeded in liberating Lothal. She paused again with a smile returning to her face. He knew we'd have a chance, Ahsoka. Ahsoka could only smile back as she knew full well that Kanan was unique and would reconnect with the Force in his way, even beyond death. I caught some of the action through Wolf, but I would assume then that things went to plan. When have we ever had a plan? Hera said jokingly. Her smile vanished and her eyes sank somewhat. Better, to answer your question, and worse. Ezra. Ahsoka knew before asking. Of course, I have no explanation for what happened. Anyone here would give you a different story, but he managed to infiltrate the Chimera, and with the help of Purgil of all things, wiped Thrawn's fleet right out of the system. She paused again before speaking. We have no idea where they've gone, and have conducted system-wide searches as we can allow, all to no avail, she finished with a somber tone. How far were you able to look? Ahsoka asked. About 5,000 parsecs total, given trajectory, however. I fear they've made for wild space. It has been some time, and in the condition those Star Destroyers were, I don't know how far they could have gone, or if he's still alive. Ahsoka raised a hand and closed her eyes without another word. The image of Hera patiently waiting with her arms folded across her chest, weight supported solely on her left foot. Ahsoka quickly acquired her balanced breathing and closed off her other senses. Her mind complained, however briefly, that this attempt would be an impossibility, yet it was her heart and spirit giving the venture all the motivation it needed. She could feel herself being pulled in all directions. The lost need guidance, the meager sustenance, and the grieving need resolution. Her mind pushed past all distraction, emotion, and doubt until it was just her and the Force, her companion. She asked the Force without moving a muscle in her body to find the boy, wherever in the universe he may be, utilizing the infinite connections through all there is to convey a solitary message. I will find you, she whispered audibly. The vastness of her query would not allow her to receive any semblance of reply anytime soon, something she was acutely aware of, necessitating the need to form it immediately. She felt the request, as it was, leave her and manifest itself tidily into the flows of the Force. Once satisfied, she opened her eyes slowly to the patiently waiting projection that hadn't moved a muscle. I cannot say if the attempt will prove fruitful, only that it has been manifest, Ahsoka said with a measure of finality. That is welcome news, Ahsoka, thank you, Hera replied. I made him a promise, Hera, one I intend to keep, Ahsoka said truthfully. He has a connection I have yet to comprehend, and a wisdom beyond his years. Kanan would truly be proud of him. He certainly would be, Hera said with intense passion. She gazed out of view momentarily, and Ahsoka feigned distraction to give Hera that moment she needed for composure. That moment passed, and what returned to Ahsoka in the hollow image was General Syndulla. We have been anticipating Imperial retribution, yet nothing has materialized. We've heard rumors of a superweapon, but haven't had any response in the affirmative. The weapon is real, and unfortunately operational. Alderaan was destroyed, Ahsoka relayed. The senator? His wife? The princess? The questions came fast from Hera. The princess is alive. I'm not positive how I know that, only I do. The others, I am afraid, she trailed off. The Alliance will need to be notified. Have you the ability? Otherwise we can from here, Hera exclaimed. Ability, yes. However, I don't have the access codes. And considering where I am headed, I don't think it would be wise to send them. Ahsoka had hoped to evade the topic of the coming mission, cursing herself silently. Ahsoka, come home. Rest, Hera said. The phrase struck Ahsoka ferociously, driving straight through her very bones. A feeling of dread washed over her, followed closely by a sense of calm. The very same words came from Vader, but not Vader. In those moments where dream and vision transcend consciousness, meaning becomes lost. An invitation from Vader was no invitation. An invitation from Anakin could mean everything. Thoughts give way to more thoughts. Is the former her destiny, the latter perhaps? At the same time, knowing a bond exists and that there is a home to go to is something that Ahsoka had never known. That Hera would extend that so graciously almost brought a tear to her eye. I need to control my emotions, she thought to herself. I have to find out what I can about the younglings, Hera, she said with a flutter she hadn't intended. Younglings? What younglings? All of them, Ahsoka said with a more authoritative voice. All of them. The Empire has been gathering Force sensitives of all ages, and although the reason may seem obvious, I think there is more at work. This has been ongoing with Sidious since the Clone Wars. And this mission will be taking you where exactly? Hera asked with a penetrating gaze. Ahsoka felt the exasperation within, putting herself back into a position of having to explain something that wasn't what it looked like. Mustafar. She mouthed the words and was surprised to hear them. Ahsoka, why? Hera took her time responding. Because, Hera, it is the last place I encountered it personally. Yes, it was a long time ago, but the Empire is terrible at sweeping everything from its records. There is a clue there. And so is Vader. Hera would not dodge the obvious. He is not my intent, Ahsoka tried to stay with assurance. Perhaps, but can you guarantee that you are not his? This stopped Ahsoka as the thought never really crossed her mind. Even Master Yoda hadn't crossed that bridge. No, she thought, his intentions were quite clear in their last encounter. If they were to meet again, she would destroy him. She had seen it. Palpatine, on the other hand, her mind trailed off. I can guarantee nothing, only to discover what's really at play, Hera. I've no intention of changing her mind, Ahsoka, please know that, only to convey my concern over venturing into the heart of the beast. Consider coming here afterward if you can. Everyone would love to see you, Hera said, the general giving way to the friend. And please, Ahsoka, be careful. I will. We will. I'll contact you soon, Ahsoka said as she toggled off the emitter and ended the transmission. It seemed so many more questions arise from just one little answer. Would her mind never cease to create new, more formidable ways to determine her demise? Vigilance was a virtue, to the point that it could lead to insanity if unchecked. She sighed and fell back in the seat, contemplating the list of concerns that only seemed to grow longer by the day. Damn it! Ahsoka heard something coming from the cargo bay below. Her mind zeroed in on her latest concern. She had insisted on Kawani coming with her. She knew she needed her, but the fomenting concern that kept recirculating throughout her very being was creating a worry, perhaps needlessly, that she may have just invited the Mirialan on a one-way journey. She laughed slightly at Kawani's response. If she were ever to voice concern, she'd tell me to suck it up because she's going anyway. With Kawani busy in the cargo bay, Ahsoka entered the cockpit to get the ship online and warmed up. Remembering to flip up and activate the scrambler before booting the navicomputer, as Kawani had taught her, she engaged the repulsors. She lifted slowly from the ground, intent on leaving as they had come. The misty forests and swamps in the forward viewport were sweeping their own form of farewell, each branch swaying from their repulsor exhaust sprayed by the water arcing away from their departure. She would miss this place, she realized. If nothing else, it was peaceful. Ani, strap in down there. I'm going to engage the drives and take us up the well, Ahsoka said as she strapped herself into the pilot's seat. Check, Master, Kawani responded over the comm, chuckling to herself. With that, the Mirai took off from the treetops and arced its way into the atmosphere with contrails of swirling mist in its wake. Please consider a like and sub. It is YouTube's way of getting these to more people. I am less concerned with subs as I am with getting the story out there, and I need your help to do that. Thank you.